The woman they buried alive. How a cast-aside wife built an empire from nothing in Wyoming. Before you read if this story moves, you hit that like button and subscribe. Every week I bring you stories of women who refused to disappear. This one might be the most impossible of them all. The weight of a single bag. The first thing Clara Ashwood did when she arrived at Hale Creek Ranch was climb onto the roof. Not that day that came 3 weeks later on a Tuesday morning, when the October sky had gone the color of hammered tin, and the wind smelled like iron and distance. But it was the moment Eli Hale understood, with the particular clarity of a man who has spent 4 years learning to expect nothing, that the woman he had hired to cook his meals and sweep his floors was not going to be easy to categorize. He had come out of the barn to find her already up there, a hammer in her hand, and a row of nails held between her lips, working along the south edge of the roof where 3 shingles had lifted in the last storm and left a gap that let the rain fall straight onto his cook stove. He stood below and looked up. She did not look down. "You're not supposed to be doing that," he said. She took the nails from between her lips one by one and set them point first into the wood. "You pay me $10 a month," she said, not stopping. "I do whatever needs doing. I hired you to cook and clean. Your stove is wet." She drove a nail home with 3 clean strikes. "Can't cook on a wet stove." Another nail. "You can come up here and argue with me, or you can stand there and let me work. Either way, the roof gets fixed." Eli Hale stood there. From the ridge of that sagging roof, Clara could see everything that would become her world. The brown grass rolling away in every direction until it met a sky so enormous it seemed to curve at the edges. The distant purple smear of the Bighorn Mountains. The creek bed that gave the ranch its name, cutting a pale line through the valley below. No other buildings. No other smoke on the horizon. Nothing but land and wind and the absolute indifference of the high plains. She breathed in. It was the first time in 8 months that her lungs felt like they had enough room. There was a quality to Wyoming air that she had no prior language for. In Cheyenne, even on clear days, the air carried something, the residue of other people, of social architecture, of the weight of being observed. She had grown so accustomed to that weight that she had stopped noticing it the way a person stops noticing the sound of a clock until it stops. The clock had stopped. The weight was gone. The air tasted of grass and cold stone and distance, and it required nothing from her at all. This, she thought. This is where a person starts over. She finished the last shingle and sat back on her heels and looked at the sky until her hands stopped trembling, not from cold, though it was cold, but from the effort of doing something that frightened her without letting it show. Heights had always frightened her. Edmund had known this, as Edmund had made it his business to know every weakness, every soft place, every point at which pressure would be productive. "You're afraid of heights, Clara. You're afraid of the dark. You're afraid of being alone. You're afraid of being too much. You're afraid of being too little." She had believed him about all of it. He had said these things with such calm authority in the same voice he used for contract law that it had never occurred to her to ask whether authority and truth were the same thing. She drove the last nail, climbed down, handed Eli the hammer. It turned out she was not afraid of heights. She was afraid of falling. Those were not the same thing at all. But that was 3 weeks later. This is what came before. She had come to Wyoming on a Thursday in the first week of September, arriving in the town of Millhaven on a hired wagon driven by a man named Pruitt, who smelled of tobacco and disinterest, and spoke perhaps 12 words over the course of 7 hours. The wagon seat was hard. The road was not a road so much as a suggestion. Clara sat with her single bag on her lap and watched the landscape change from something familiar into something that seemed to belong to a different planet entirely. 3 weeks before that, on a Sunday afternoon in Cheyenne, Edmund Voss had stood in the parlor of their home on Cary Avenue, A parlor full of their friends, their colleagues, their social circle, every person who constituted the scaffolding of the life Clara had believed she was building, and he had said in the polite and measured voice he used for closing arguments that he was filing for divorce on grounds of his wife's inability to fulfill the fundamental duties of the marital state. He did not use the word barren. Edmund was a lawyer. He understood the power of implication over declaration. But the word was in the room anyway, hanging in the air, above the petit four, and the good china, and the faces of 20 people who had known Clara for 3 years, and would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. Clara had stood very still. She had learned stillness from Edmund. It was the one useful thing their marriage had given her. She had not cried. She had not argued. She had nodded once in the way a person nods when they are handed information so large that the mind can only accept it as an abstraction. And then she had excused herself, walked upstairs to their bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed until the sounds of the parlor below faded, and the house grew quiet, and the afternoon light moved across the floor from one wall to the other. Later she would understand that Edmund had arranged the audience with the care of a man who understood spectacle as strategy. A private announcement could be contested, negotiated, reframed. A public one became its own kind of document, witnessed, sealed, impossible to revise. He had named her deficiency in front of 20 people so that the narrative was established before she had the chance to offer another one. She couldn't give him children. What could he do? She had heard it in their voices. The guests who did not know she could hear them through the plaster. Not cruel voices, most of them. Simply voices that had accepted the frame he offered them and found it reasonable. That was worse somehow than cruelty. Cruelty required investment. Reasonableness required nothing at all. She sat on the edge of the bed until the house was dark, and then she began to pack. She did not take much. The good china was his, as his mother had made emphatically clear when it arrived as a wedding gift. The furniture was his. The social connections, the friendships, the invitations and memberships and subscriptions that had constituted the outer structure of her life, all of it had been his first, and hers only, by extension. And she understood now that extension could be revoked. She had lived in his house. She had operated in his world. She had organized her own existence around the schedule of his career. She had been so careful to be useful. She had believed in some persistent and unexamined way that being useful was the same as being loved. What she took fit in one bag. This was not a tragedy. It was information. 3 doctors over the course of 3 years had examined her and delivered their conclusions with varying degrees of sympathy. Structural abnormalities, unfavorable anatomical configuration, conception highly unlikely. The words were different, but the verdict was the same, and Edmund had received each one with the grave and patient expression of a man accepting an unfortunate but unavoidable business outcome. She had believed them. Why wouldn't she? They were doctors. They had instruments and Latin terminology and the settled authority of men who spent their lives knowing things other people didn't. She had believed them right up until the moment on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after arriving at Hale Creek Ranch, when she was standing on the roof in the wind, with a hammer in her hand, and realized that she no longer cared what they had said. Not because she doubted them, simply because whatever they had decided about her body had no power here. Out here on this roof, in this wind, under this sky, what mattered was whether the shingle held. She drove the last nail home and climbed down. Eli Hale was still standing there. He had an expression she was beginning to recognize, a kind of suspended uncertainty, as though the world kept presenting him with situations his considerable competence did not cover. "Stove should be dry by noon," Clara said, handing him the hammer. "I'll have dinner on by 6. She went inside and put water on to boil. She had arrived at Hale Creek Ranch on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before the roof incident delivered by Pruitt and his wagon, to the end of a track that disappeared into the grass 40 yards from the house, as though the prairie had simply absorbed it. Her first impression of Eli Hale was not of his size, though he was large, well over 6 feet broad in the shoulder, the kind of man who looked like he had been assembled for the specific purpose of surviving hard weather. Her first impression was of his hands. He had come out onto the porch when the wagon stopped, and she had noticed before anything else that his hands were loose at his sides. Not relaxed, there was nothing relaxed about him, but deliberately still, the way a man holds himself still when stillness requires effort. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a face weathered past the point where age was easy to guess, eyes that were the particular gray of clouds before snow, and that did not look at her so much as assess her, not unkindly but carefully, the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand before committing to an opinion. "Mrs. Ashwood," he said, not a question. "Mr. Hale." He took her bag from Pruitt, without asking, carried it inside. Without comment, set it in the small room at the end of the hall that would be hers, and then stood in the doorway and told her the arrangements. Breakfast before first light, dinner at sundown. Laundry Mondays. The house had a good stove once you understood its character. The well pump was in the kitchen, a luxury, he said, as though he wanted to be fair about the terms. Town was 14 miles south Millhaven. He went monthly for supplies. She was welcome to come. "Any questions?" he asked. "What happened to the person who had this room before me?" Something crossed his face too fast to read, but she saw it. "No one's had this room before you," he said. "I've been managing alone." "How long?" 4 years. He left her to settle in. Clara stood in the small room and looked at the narrow bed, the single window that faced west, the hook on the back of the door. She unpacked her bag. 2 dresses besides the one she was wearing. Underclothes. A nightgown. A hairbrush that had belonged to her mother before her mother became someone Clara was learning not to think about. A small photograph of her brother Thomas, who had died of fever at 14 and remained in some permanent way the last person in her family who had ever made her feel like herself. She set the photograph on the windowsill. It was the only decoration she would allow. She had one other thing wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of the bag. A small glass jar, no bigger than her fist, sealed with a cork. Inside it, a teaspoon or so of gray ash. She set the jar on the windowsill next to the photograph of Thomas. 3 weeks earlier, on the wagon from Cheyenne, she had taken the divorce papers Edmund's lawyer had given her, 3 pages of elegant legal language that reduced her to a category, a deficiency, a problem to be solved. And she had lit them with a match from her traveling case and held them until the last corner curled and caught, and there was nothing left but heat against her fingers. She had intended to let the ash blow away in the wind. At the last moment she had caught it in the jar instead. She wasn't sure why, only that it felt important to have proof that it was over, proof that she had been the one to end it, even if only in this small private way. Proof that she had stood in the middle of the Wyoming plains and watched the document that had defined her inadequacy turn to nothing, and she had not wept. She had not wept. The jar sat on the windowsill and caught the afternoon light and turned it amber. Reminder, she thought. That was what it was. A reminder that everything that could burn had already burned. What was left was what didn't. The first week was the work of learning. She learned the stove a cast-iron beast with opinions about draft and kindling that she eventually came to think of as a personality rather than a flaw. She learned the pump, which needed priming on cold mornings. She learned that the chickens were kept in a coop behind the barn, that the red hen had a grudge against the world and expressed it through her beak, that the eggs needed collecting twice a day, or the red hen would sit on them out of spite. She learned Eli Hale. He was, she discovered, a man of absolute routine. He rose before dawn. He worked without stopping until dark. He came in for meals, ate with full attention, and said almost nothing that wasn't necessary. He was not cold, not the way Edmund had been cold, which was a specific kind of coldness that involved warmth on the surface and a draft underneath. Eli was simply someone who had stopped expecting conversation and forgotten that it was possible. He noticed things, though. She caught him noticing the way the kitchen had been rearranged so the flour was closer to the stove, the mended place on the curtain by the window the first morning she had the coffee ready before he was dressed. He didn't comment. But he noticed, and she knew it, and that was its own kind of language. On the 5th day, he came in at noon and found her at the table with a piece of paper and a pencil writing a list. "What's that?" he asked. "Inventory," she said. "You're low on salt pork and nearly out of baking soda. You have enough coffee for about 3 weeks. The lard is going rancid, it needs to be replaced." He looked at the list. "I usually just know." "You've been managing alone. It's different when someone else is cooking." He looked at the list for another moment. Then he took out his own piece of paper and copied it. That was the closest thing to a compliment she received in the first week, and she found to her own surprise that it was enough. On the 7th day, a woman appeared on a horse. She arrived without warning, which Clara would eventually understand was simply how Nora Briggs operated. She did not announce herself, because she had decided some years ago that the world was generally improved by her presence and did not require advance notice. She was perhaps 35, with a sun-darkened face and brown hair pinned up with the minimum architecture necessary to keep it from her eyes, and she rode the way people who learned young ride casually with her whole body, as though the horse were an extension of thought rather than a separate creature requiring management. She pulled up at the porch and looked at Clara in the doorway with frank and undisguised curiosity. "You're the new one," she said. "Nora Briggs. My place is 15 miles northeast. I heard Eli finally hired someone sensible." Clara Ashwood. "How did you hear Bess Hooper?" "She told Sarah Oakes at the feed store. Sarah told my husband when he went for grain." Nora swung down from the horse with the economy of someone who has dismounted approximately 10,000 times. "Small territory. News travels." She looked at the house appraisingly, then back at Clara. "You look less broken than I expected." "I'm sorry." "Bess said you'd come from Cheyenne under difficult circumstances." Her tone managed to be both frank and entirely without malice, which Clara was beginning to understand was a Wyoming characteristic. "I expected someone who looked knocked sideways. You look intact." "I'm managing," Clara said. "Better than managing, I'd say." Nora tied her horse at the porch rail with the ease of long habit. "Is there coffee? I've been riding since before light." Clara stepped back. "Come in." What Nora Briggs was, Clara would come to understand, a category of woman that the frontier produced in greater numbers than any other environment, someone who had been tested by circumstances that would have destroyed a more fragile constitution, and had come out the other side, not harder exactly, but cleaner, stripped of everything decorative, and left with only the structural. She had been widowed young, had run her own ranch alone for 2 years before remarrying, had buried an infant, had survived a prairie fire that took half her outbuildings. She wore her history lightly, the way people wear a coat. They've had long enough to forget it's there. She drank her coffee and looked around the kitchen, and asked direct questions that were somehow never intrusive, because they came from genuine, rather than performed interest. "How do you find Eli?" "Quiet," Clara said. "But fair." "Both accurate." Nora wrapped both hands around her cup. "He's been alone too long. You can see it. He's got the habit of not expecting anything from company, so he stops asking for it." She paused. "He's a good man, though. One of the few out here who actually is rather than just being considered so." "I know," Clara said. She said it without thinking, then was slightly surprised to find she meant it. She had known it for some time, she realized. Possibly from the first day, in the way you recognize certain things before you have the language for them. Nora looked at her over the rim of her cup, with the assessing quality of a woman who has spent years reading people, and is rarely wrong. She didn't say anything. but her expression said interesting. She stayed for 2 hours and left with the promise to come back. Clara stood on the porch and watched her ride north into the grassland and felt for the first time since arriving in Wyoming something that resembled the ordinary human comfort of having a friend. On her 9th day at the ranch, Eli told her he was going to Millhaven for supplies. She could come if she wanted. The wagon left at first light. She came. Millhaven was not much a cluster of buildings at a crossroads, a main street that was more ambition than fact, a general store that doubled as the post office, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly south, a saloon that was already busy at 10 in the morning. There was a doctor's office, a blacksmith, a land office with a hand-lettered sign that was partially obscured by a new sign advertising the Crossland and Cattle Company. Clara noted the second sign. She filed it away. The general store was run by a man named Hooper and his wife Bess, who was a compact and efficient woman with sharp eyes and the quality of someone who considered information a form of currency. She watched Clara from the moment they walked in. "Oh, you must be the new housekeeper," Bess said, not to Clara, but to the general air of the store, which had 3 other customers in it, who were now listening with visible attention. Word was Eli Hale had finally hired someone. "Mrs. Ashwood," Clara said. "Bess Hooper." She looked Clara over with the same frank assessment Clara was beginning to recognize as the characteristic expression of the Wyoming frontier, where there was too little time and too much at stake for social circumlocution. "You're from back east." "Cheyenne. That's not really back east, but it's back east enough for out here." She began pulling items from the shelves as Clara read from her list. "You find everything you need at the ranch." "The stove took some learning." "Always does. Eli built it himself, did he tell you that?" She set a tin of baking soda on the counter. "Built most of the house himself after." She stopped. Reset. "He's a capable man." After. The word sat in the air between them, and Clara did not ask what came after it, and Bess Hooper looked briefly grateful. While Eli was at the blacksmith, Clara completed her shopping and carried the parcels to the wagon, then walked a little way down the main street, because there was nothing stopping her. She passed the land office with its double-signed window. Through the glass, she could see a large man at a desk, silver-haired. Expensive-suited, the kind of man who looks comfortable everywhere because he has made a study of appearing so. He was looking at a map. He happened to look up. His eyes met Clara's through the glass. He smiled. It was the practiced smile of a man who smiles at women on streets out of habit, automatically, like tipping a hat to anything female. It said nothing about her specifically. It said, "I notice you exist. I assign you no particular importance." And she had spent 3 years being noticed in exactly that way by Edmund's colleagues, seen without being seen, registered without being counted. She recognized the smile the way you recognize a smell from childhood, instantly and entirely. She walked on. She did not know his name yet. She would learn it soon enough. At the edge of town, near the church, she passed a woman carrying a basket of washing with a toddler attached to her skirt, like a small determined anchor. The woman glanced up, nodded, moved on. Clara nodded back. That was the entirety of their exchange, and yet it contained something, the minimal acknowledgement of 2 people who occupied the same difficult geography and understood this about each other without needing to discuss it. This was something else Wyoming was teaching her, that acknowledgement didn't require words. That respect, at its foundation, was simply a matter of seeing another person clearly and not looking away. They were halfway home, the wagon jolting over the ruts, the grass on either side turning gold in the afternoon light, when Eli spoke without preamble. "Sarah Oakes said hello." Clara looked at him. "I didn't meet anyone named Sarah Oakes." "She wasn't there today. She usually is. She helps her husband at the feed store on Wednesdays." He was watching the road. "She'll want to know about you." "Is that a warning?" He thought about it. "More of an accounting," he said. Small town. People pay attention to what happens at other people's properties, particularly when... He stopped, reconsidered. Particularly mine. There was something in the pause that Clara chose not to press. Not yet. She had learned in 9 days that Eli Hale would eventually say what he meant. He just needed to locate it first. What should she know? Clara asked. That you work for me. That the arrangement is what it is. Another pause. Nothing else to know. All right, Clara said. And then, because she had also learned in 9 days that silence could be a form of honesty, people will assume whatever they want to assume. We can't prevent that. No, Eli agreed. But we can be clear about the facts. What are the facts? He glanced at her. The corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. You cook well. You don't complain. You fix the roof. He looked back at the road. Those are the facts. Clara looked out at the prairie. I'll try to keep it that way, she said. They rode the rest of the way in silence. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't require anything from either of them. Clara watched the light change on the mountains and thought that she had been in Wyoming for 9 days and had not yet woken up wishing she were somewhere else. That was new. The letter was in the second drawer of the kitchen dresser. Clara found it on a Sunday afternoon in her 3rd week at the ranch while reorganizing the dresser so the cooking supplies were where her hands expected them to be. She was not looking for anything. She moved a stack of cloth, a collection of mismatched buttons, a coil of wire, and there it was an envelope unsealed, the paper soft at the folds, in a way that meant it had been opened and refolded many times. She should have put it back. She knew that. She read it instead. It was short, 4 paragraphs in a handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone writing under difficulty. Eli. If you're reading this, then what I feared has happened. I want you to know that I'm not afraid. I know you'll think I should be. And that will be harder for you than the fear would have been for me. I need to say something you won't want to hear. You've spent our whole marriage building walls around the things you love because you're afraid of losing them. I've loved you for it, and I've been frustrated by it in equal measure. But I need you to understand, the walls didn't protect me. Nothing could have. That's not how it works. The baby and I will be with you in whatever way is true after this. I don't know what way that is, but I believe it. Last thing, don't let the fear win. Don't let it convince you that loving someone is too dangerous to try again. I have loved you without reservation, and it has been the best thing I ever did. Don't take that away from me by making it the reason you stop. I love you. I will always have loved you. M. Clara read it twice. She stood in the kitchen with the afternoon light on the window and the sound of wind outside and the distant sound of Eli somewhere near the barn, and she read the letter twice, and then she folded it exactly along its existing creases and put it back in the drawer beneath the cloth, and the buttons and the wire exactly as she had found it. She closed the drawer. She stood at the counter for a moment, with her hands flat on the wood. Margaret, she thought. Her name had been Margaret. Clara had not known that. She had known there had been a wife, Bess Hooper's unfinished sentence, the way the bedroom was empty, the way Eli held himself like a man carrying something invisible and heavy. But she had not known the name until now. Had not known that Margaret had known she was going to die, and had written to her husband from somewhere inside that knowledge, and asked him not to let the fear win. The letter changed something in the way Clara saw the man who worked from dawn to dark, and ate in silence, and noticed everything, and said very little. She did not feel sorry for him. Pity was too simple and too comfortable, and she had had enough of being on the receiving end of it to know it solved nothing. What she felt was something harder and more useful, a kind of recognition. The recognition of one person who has been badly broken by loss for another, She had been broken in a different way by a different kind of loss. But she knew the posture. She knew the careful economy of someone who has learned to want very little, so there is very little to take away. Don't let the fear win, Margaret had written. Clara stood in the kitchen and thought, I know exactly what that means. She did not say anything to Eli about the letter. Not that day, not in the days that followed. It was not hers to say anything about. But she knew afterward that she would not let herself be afraid of him, not in the way she had been afraid in the first weeks, the background fear of a woman alone in a strange place with a strange man. Eli Hale was not something to be afraid of. He was someone to be patient with, and patience, Clara was discovering, was something Wyoming had a great deal to teach. October brought frost and then harder frost, and then 3 days of relentless gray sky and a wind that found every crack in the house's aging construction. Clara spent those days in methodical domestic battle stuffing gaps with cloth, banking the stove, learning the precise angle at which the chimney draft worked, and the precise angle at which it sulked. Eli, meanwhile, spent those days doing the kind of outdoor work that Clara was beginning to understand was permanent and Sisyphean. There was always a fence to repair, always equipment to tend, always some part of the operation that the weather was slowly winning against. She watched him from the kitchen window, sometimes a dark figure moving across pale ground, his breath showing in the cold air. On the 4th night he came in later than usual. Clara had held dinner. She did not say so. He washed, sat, ate. Then he said without preamble, Harlan Cross came by today. Clara looked up from her plate. Cross Land and Cattle, he said. You'd have seen the sign in Millhaven. The man in the land office. He nodded. He's been buying up ranches in this valley for 2 years. Mostly the ones that are struggling low water years, bad winters, debts they can't cover. He makes an offer that sounds reasonable. By the time they read the contract, most of them don't have a lawyer to tell them it's not. Clara set down her fork. What did he want? Same thing he always wants. Land. Eli looked at the table. He made an offer. Said it was fair market price, said he'd let me keep grazing rights for 2 more seasons. Said the contract was standard. A pause. He left a copy. May I see it? He looked at her. You know contracts. My husband was a lawyer. The word still sat strange in her mouth, not painful exactly, more like a word in a language she used to speak fluently and had mostly forgotten. I read enough of his work over 3 years to know where to look. Eli got up and brought a folded document from the shelf by the door. Clara smoothed it out on the table. She read it carefully the way Edmund had taught her without meaning to teach her. Starting with the definitions section, then the operative clauses, then the qualifications, then the fine print that most people read last, and many people didn't read at all. She found it in the 7th clause. Here, she said. She turned the document and set her finger on the paragraph. This language appurtenant property and improvements thereto, that's not just the land. That includes everything on the land and attached to the land. Fences, structures, water rights. She moved her finger. And here livestock and agricultural implements held in common use on the described property. That's your cattle, your horses, your equipment. She looked at him. He's not offering to buy your land, Mr. Hale. He's offering to buy everything you own. Eli read the paragraph. He read it again. Standard contract, he said. His voice was very flat. For someone who wants to take everything, yes. He sat back, looked at the ceiling, looked at Clara. He's coming back Thursday for my answer. Tell him you need more time to review the terms. He'll say there are other buyers. There aren't. Not at his price. She had grown up at the edges of enough business conversations to know the shape of a seller's leverage. He's been buying distressed properties. This ranch is not distressed. He needs to offer you more than he wants to, or he doesn't get it at all. The time pressure is a performance. Eli looked at her for a long moment, with the particular quality of assessment she had come to recognize. Not skeptical, not doubtful, simply taking his time to be sure. All right, he said finally. I can write the letter if you want. Give him a list of questions about the contract terms. It'll buy you time and tell you something about his intentions by how he responds. You'd do that? It wasn't quite a question. I'd do that, Clara said. It's not very different from fixing the roof. Something needed doing. The corner of his mouth moved. I'm beginning to think there are a lot of things you consider not very different from fixing roofs. Most problems aren't that different, Clara said. They just need someone to climb up and take a look. She wrote the letter the next morning. It was measured and precise, 3 specific questions about the contract language, a request for written clarification on the livestock clause, a note that she was consulting with an attorney in Cheyenne before making any decisions. The attorney was invented, but the threat was real enough. Eli read it twice, then signed it. I'll send it with the stage. Don't look satisfied when Cross reads it, Clara said. Let him think you're just being careful. I am just being careful. Exactly. Just make sure he knows you're not afraid of him. He handed the letter back. Their fingers did not quite touch in the exchange. Are you often like this? He asked. Like what? Useful in unexpected directions. Clara folded the letter and tucked it into the envelope she had already addressed. I've spent 3 years being told I was deficient, she said. I've had time to figure out what I'm actually good at. She handed him the envelope and went back to the kitchen. Eli Hale stood in the doorway for a moment. She could feel him there. And then she heard him put on his coat and go out to find Pruitt's boy, who ran errands to the stage line. November came in with the particular ferocity that the Wyoming prairie seemed to reserve for the month that followed the last warmth of fall, as though the land itself was demonstrating what it was truly capable of. And the relative gentleness of the summer months had been a temporary courtesy that was now formally rescinded. The first big storm arrived on a Thursday night, 3 days after Clara had been at the ranch for exactly 2 months. She woke to the sound of the wind trying the corners of the house, not the usual howl, but something lower and more sustained. A sound with purpose in it. She got up and went to the kitchen window and looked out, and saw nothing except white. Eli was already in the kitchen. He was dressed for outside coffee, made a lamp burning on the table. He looked at her in the lamplight with the expression she had come to read, as this is manageable, but it requires attention. Bad one, he said. I'm going to check the animals. Stay inside. I'll fill the water containers first. I said stay. The pump will freeze in an hour. She was already pulling her coat from the hook. 2 people work faster than 1. We have an hour. Stop arguing. He stopped arguing. They worked together in the howling dark, moving between the barn and the house, filling every container that would hold water. The cold was absolute, the kind of cold that wasn't a temperature, so much as a pressure, something that pushed against every exposed surface of skin and found its way through wool and leather regardless. Clara worked without speaking, matching Eli's pace, and by the time they came in, the last time, she could not feel her fingers. Eli built the fire up. Clara put water on for coffee. They stood on opposite sides of the stove, thawing. Good thinking, he said, about the pump. Thank you. A pause. The storm outside made itself known in ways that were increasingly architectural, the house groaning along its frame, the window glass vibrating in its sash. It'll last 2 days, Eli said. Maybe 3. We have enough supplies. I know. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and felt the heat move up her arms. I inventoried last week. He looked at her. Of course you did. They sat at the table. The lamp between them threw a circle of yellow light that ended sharply at the walls. Clara thought about the letter in the dresser drawer, "Don't let the fear win," and thought about the woman who had written it, and the man across the table who had read it so many times. The paper had gone soft. Mr. Hale, she said. You don't have to tell me anything, but I want you to know I found the letter, in the dresser. I wasn't looking for it. She held his gaze. I read it. I'm sorry. I should have put it back without reading it. Eli was very still. I put it back exactly as I found it, Clara said. I haven't said anything and I won't. I just wanted you to know, so there wasn't something unspoken between us. The silence lasted long enough that she thought she had miscalculated badly. Then Eli set down his cup and looked at his hands. Her name was Margaret, he said. I know, Clara said gently. From the letter. She died in the winter, 4 years ago. The baby. He stopped, started again. The baby came too early. There wasn't enough time to get help. He looked at the lamp. I built this house thinking it was sturdy enough, strong enough. I made it against the cold and the wind, and I thought that was enough. His jaw tightened. It wasn't a question of the house. No, Clara said. It wasn't. I know that. I've known it for 4 years. He looked up. Knowing it and believing it are different things. Clara thought about Edmund, standing in the parlor on Carey Avenue, his perfectly modulated voice, his hand-chosen audience, his surgical use of her body's supposed failures as a public instrument of her humiliation. She thought about the 3 doctors with their clipboards and their Latin. She thought about her mother saying, "Go somewhere you can be useful," with the precise intonation of someone who has decided that one of their children is a practical problem rather than a person. She thought about all the things she had known for 3 years and had not yet fully believed. Yes, she said, I know exactly what you mean. The storm pressed against the house. The fire crackled. Outside, the Wyoming winter did what it had always done and would always do without reference to the people sheltering from it. They sat in the lamplight and said nothing for a long time, and it was the most honest conversation Clara had had in years. 3 days later, when the storm broke and left the ranch buried in a white silence that transformed every familiar shape into something unfamiliar and clean, Clara stood in the yard with her face in the sun and her feet in 2 feet of snow, and thought, I have not woken up wishing I were somewhere else. Not once. Not in 10 weeks. Eli came out of the barn behind her, a shovel in his hand, squinting in the hard post-storm light. He stopped when he saw her standing there. You're not wearing enough, he said. I'll go in a minute. She didn't move. I want to see it. He came and stood beside her. Not close, a proper distance, the distance of employer and employee, the distance of 2 careful people. But beside her, looking out at the same thing. The creek was frozen solid. The mountains were sharp against a sky that was the particular blue that only existed after a storm, a blue so deep it seemed to have weight. The snow on the prairie caught the sun and threw it back in a million small pieces of light. Margaret loved the snow, Eli said. He said it the way a man says something he has been holding for a long time, not with grief exactly, but with the specific weight of something that has been carried so long it has become part of the body. She said it made everything equal. Everything underneath it, the good land and the bad land, looked the same. Clara looked at the prairie. She was right, she said. Eli looked at her briefly, then back at the snow. She was right about most things, he said. I'm beginning to think she was right about more of them than I've given her credit for. He walked toward the barn with his shovel, and Clara stood in the snow in the hard, clean light, and she thought about a woman she had never met, who had written a letter she wasn't supposed to read, and she thought, thank you. Then she went inside to start dinner. She paused at the door, went one hand on the frame. In her room, on the windowsill, the jar of ash caught the winter light and held it, amber glass, gray powder, the remnant of a document that had tried to define her. Clara looked at it for a moment, then went to the stove. That evening, after the dishes were done, and Eli had gone to his room, she sat at the kitchen table with a candle and wrote a letter she would not send. It was not addressed to Edmund. It was not addressed to her mother, or to the 3 doctors, or to any of the people who had assembled their certainties about her, like a verdict. It was addressed to herself. "You are in Wyoming," she wrote. "You have been here for 11 weeks. You have learned to build a fire in a difficult stove, and to read weather in a quality of light, and to calm a man who does not know how to be calmed. You have learned that the things they said about you were incomplete at best, and dishonest at worst. You are not finished. You are not even close." She folded the letter and tucked it into the back of her Bible, the one book she had not been able to leave in Cheyenne. Not for the scripture, she had a complicated relationship with the scripture, but because it had been Thomas's, and his handwriting was in the margins small and tershunts, and full of the particular misspellings of a 14-year-old boy who was always thinking faster than he was writing. "You are not finished." And she blew out the candle. In the dark, the jar of ash was invisible. But she knew it was there, and knowing it was enough. Outside, the wind had dropped. The prairie lay under its blanket of snow, in the absolute silence that follows storms, that specific hush of a world that has been rearranged and is not yet accustomed to its new shape. Clara lay in her narrow bed and listened to that silence and thought, 11 weeks ago, I had nothing. She was beginning to understand that nothing had been the wrong word. She had had herself. She had simply not yet learned what that was worth. She was learning. End of Part 1. Note word count approximately 7,550 words. Part 1. Complete. The things we bury in winter. December arrived the way all things arrived on the Wyoming frontier, without announcement, without apology, and with the full force of its intentions already in motion. Clara had been at Hale Creek Ranch for 3 months when the cold became something other than a season. It became the primary fact of existence. Everything else, work, meals, conversation, thought, organized itself around the central question of heat. How to make it, how to keep it, how to ensure it would still be there in the morning. The stove, once an adversary, had become an ally. She had learned its language the way she had learned everything else here, by paying attention, by making mistakes, by refusing to be defeated by something that could not, after all, actually think. Eli had given her his extra wool blanket without comment, setting it folded on the kitchen table one morning with the wordless practicality that characterized most of his generosity. She had taken it with equal wordlessness. This was one of the small grammars they had developed, a vocabulary of practical gestures that said the things neither of them had practiced saying aloud. She had been watching that grammar grow for weeks. The way he always left a lamp burning in the kitchen when he came in after dark, so she would not wake to a cold room. The way she always had coffee ready before he was dressed and never remarked on it. The way he had some weeks ago stopped saying Mrs. Ashwood and started saying Clara with the slight hesitation of a man using a word he has decided is accurate, but is still getting used to the weight of. She did not remark on that either. There was between them a careful and mutual project of not remarking. Clara understood it for what it was. 2 people who had been hurt by careless words, building very slowly a space where words could be trusted again. It was Nora Briggs who named it first. She came on a Thursday in early December, arriving, as she always did, without warning, but with the compensatory offering of a jar of preserved peaches from her summer stores, which Clara accepted with genuine gratitude, and immediately planned to use in a pie that would make December feel less like punishment. They sat at the kitchen table in the way they had established over several visits, Nora with her boots off and her feet toward the stove, Clara with her mending, both of them talking in the manner of women who have limited time and no patience for circumlocution. "You've settled in," Nora observed. "I have." "More than settled." Nora pulled at a loose thread on her cuff. "You look like someone who belongs here." Clara looked up. "Is that a good thing?" "Out here it's the only thing. Nora glanced toward the barn, visible through the frost-edged window, where Eli's figure moved between the doors. He's different too. Different how? Less careful. She said it simply as a matter of fact. Eli has been careful for 4 years. Careful the way a man is careful when he's decided the world is full of things that can break him, and he's going to move through it without touching anything. You've made him less careful. A pause. That's a good thing, too, before you ask. Clara set down her mending. Nora, I work for him. I know that. The arrangement is clear. The arrangement, Nora said, in the tone of a woman who has lived long enough to have opinions about arrangements, is what people tell themselves while something else is happening. Clara looked at her. I'm not suggesting anything improper, Nora said mildly. I'm suggesting that 2 people can spend months sharing meals and silences and blizzards, and gradually become something to each other that didn't have a name when they started. She picked up her coffee. I'm suggesting that you know this already, and you're deciding what to do about it. Clara was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like water. He's not ready, she said finally. No, Nora agreed. But he's closer than he was. The letter from Dorothy Voss arrived on a Wednesday, tucked inside the regular mail packet that came with the monthly supply wagon from Millhaven. Clara recognized the handwriting before she recognized the name on the return address. It was the handwriting of a woman who had been taught to write by someone who believed that penmanship was a form of character, precise. Controlled each letter, formed with the deliberateness of someone who trusted nothing to chance. She read it at the kitchen table while Eli was in the south field. Mrs. Ashwood, I write to you on behalf of my brother Edmund, though I will confess that I also write on my own behalf, which is a distinction I have not always been honest enough to make. I am coming to Millhaven in the 2nd week of January. Edmund has asked me to bring certain documents for your signature, a final settlement instrument that would resolve all outstanding legal questions regarding your marriage and its dissolution. I would encourage you to review this document carefully before I arrive. Edmund's attorney has described it as routine. In my experience, things his attorney describes as routine require the most attention. I will be direct with you, Mrs. Ashwood, because I find directness is undervalued in correspondence of this kind. Edmund is aware that you are living in proximity to a man of some property. He would like to ensure that certain legal questions are resolved before that proximity leads to any arrangements that might complicate matters for all involved. I will come to the ranch if you will receive me. I believe it is better to speak face to face. D. Voss. Clara read it twice. Then she read it a 3rd time, slowly, attending to the particular quality of the language the way Dorothy had framed her brother's interest, while quietly signaling her own, the word routine offered, and immediately undercut the phrase, I also write, on my own behalf, which was either a courtesy or a warning, and she was not yet sure which. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. That evening, she told Eli. He listened without interrupting a quality she had come to value highly, having spent 3 years with a man who interrupted as a form of argument. When she finished, he sat for a moment, looking at his coffee cup. You don't have to see her, he said. I know. Clara turned her own cup in her hands. I want to. Why? She thought about it. Because I've spent 3 years letting Edmund's family make decisions about my life while I waited in the next room. I'd rather be in the room this time. She looked up. And because I want to see her face when she tells me what's in that document. Eli looked at her steadily. Whatever it says, you don't have to sign anything. I know that too. She almost smiled. I know what a contract looks like, remember. The corner of his mouth moved. I remember. I'll write back. Tell her to come. Clara stood and took their cups to the basin. Whatever Edmund wants from me, I'd rather know what it is. January came in cold and clear and merciless, the kind of Wyoming January that made the previous November seem like a courtesy. The creek froze so solidly that Eli could walk across it, which he did each morning to check the cattle on the north pasture, with a matter-of-factness that Clara had come to understand was the frontier's primary emotional register. Not indifference, but a trained refusal to be surprised by difficulty. Dorothy Voss arrived on the 12th of January on the stage from Cheyenne to Millhaven, and from there on a hired wagon, whose driver had the expression of a man who had been asked to travel 14 miles of frozen road for a fare that did not quite compensate for the inconvenience. Clara saw the wagon from the kitchen window and had the coffee on the table before Dorothy reached the porch. Edmund's sister was 53 years old, though she carried it the way certain women carry age, not denying it, but refusing to be reduced by it. She was tall, narrow-dressed in good traveling clothes that had absorbed the journey with better grace than she had. Her face was angular and sharp, and her eyes, when they settled on Clara in the doorway, were the same pale gray as Edmund's, the color of weather about to change. "Mrs. Ashwood," she said. "Miss Voss, come in." But Dorothy entered the house with the particular quality of a woman who is accustomed to assessing interiors without appearing to do so. Clara watched her take in the clean kitchen, the organized shelves, the 2 cups on the table, the single lamp burning against the January gray. "You've made it comfortable," Dorothy said. "I've tried." Dorothy sat, accepted coffee, wrapped both hands around the cup with the involuntary relief of someone who has been cold for longer than she would admit. They regarded each other across the table. "I appreciate your willingness to receive me," Dorothy said. "I appreciated your letter," Clara said, "particularly the part about routine." Something shifted in Dorothy's expression, the faintest recalibration, the look of a person who has been accurately read and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. "Yes," she said after a moment, "that part." Then she reached into her traveling case and produced a folded document, fewer pages than Clara expected, which meant either genuine simplicity or skillful compression of complexity. She set it on the table without pushing it toward Clara. "Edmund wants you to sign this," she said. "He's asked me to tell you it's a final legal settlement, a release of all claims arising from the marriage and its dissolution." "And what does it actually say?" Dorothy looked at the document. "Among other things, it contains a prohibition on your remarrying for a period of 5 years from the date of the divorce decree." Clara kept her face very still. "That's not standard." "No. Why does he want that?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of evasion, but the quiet of a person deciding exactly how honest to be. "Edmund has remarried," she said. "His wife is from a good family. There are questions in certain circles about the grounds for his first divorce. If you were to remarry quickly, particularly to a man of property, it would invite comparisons that Edmund would prefer to avoid." "He divorced me on grounds of my physical incapacity," Clara said. "Any comparison drawn from my remarrying would reflect on his judgment, not his character. Unless—" She stopped. Let the silence sit. Dorothy looked at the table. "Unless the grounds he cited were not accurate," Clara finished. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the frozen yard with a sound like something being erased. "I don't know what you mean," Dorothy said. But she said it to the table, not to Clara. "Yes, you do." Clara did not raise her voice. She had learned from Edmund again, without his intending to teach her that a voice raised was a position weakened. "I've been in Wyoming for 4 months. I'm not ill. I have no symptoms of the condition your brother's doctors described. I've wondered since arriving here whether the diagnosis was accurate. I'm beginning to think it wasn't." Dorothy set down her coffee cup with a deliberateness that was its own kind of answer. "Miss Voss," Clara said quietly, Your letter said you were also writing on your own behalf. I'd like to know what that means." The silence lasted a long time. Long enough that Clara heard the horses shift in the barn. Long enough that the fire settled in the stove with a sound like a deep breath. Then Dorothy reached into her traveling case a second time. She took out a smaller piece of paper, not a document, just a single folded sheet, and set it on the table between them. She did not push it toward Clara. She did not explain it. She simply set it there and looked out the window at the frozen yard. Clara picked it up and unfolded it. It was a bank receipt, dated 3 years ago, November, 4 months before Edmund had filed for divorce. A payment of $300 from Edmund Voss to a doctor, Frederick Gaines described in the notation line as professional consultation services. $300. Clara had never received professional services from a Dr. Frederick Gaines. She had been examined by 3 doctors in Cheyenne, and none of them had been named Gaines. She looked at Dorothy. "Edmund needed grounds," Dorothy said. She was still looking out the window. Her voice was level, the voice of a person reciting something they have memorized in order to be able to say it without feeling it. "He had decided before he married you that he needed a specific kind of settlement, a clean legal basis. The doctors who examined you were not—" She stopped. Their reports were not entirely their own. "He paid for the diagnosis," Clara said. "He paid for the documentation." Dorothy's jaw was tight. "I want you to understand that I didn't know until afterward. I found the receipt in his papers when I was handling the household accounts after his first wife's, after the early years." A pause. "His first wife." Clara was very still. "You said first wife. Edmund was married before you." Dorothy finally looked at her. "Briefly. The first marriage was annulled on grounds of the wife's alleged instability. She went east. I have never been certain the instability was hers." She looked at the receipt on the table. "Edmund is good at documentation." The kitchen was absolutely still. Clara looked at the receipt. She thought about 3 years of believing a thing about herself that was not true. She thought about the exact quality of shame that comes from being told you are deficient in a fundamental way. The way it gets into the body becomes part of how you hold yourself, becomes the lens through which you read every other thing about your life. She thought about Edmund's voice in the parlor on Cary Avenue, his measured certainty, his hand-chosen audience. She did not feel rage. She was surprised to find she did not feel rage. What she felt was something colder and more useful, the particular clarity that comes when a thing you have half suspected for a long time is finally confirmed, and you realize that some part of you already knew and was simply waiting for permission to act on it. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "Because I should have told you 3 years ago." Dorothy's voice was steady, but her hands, Clara noticed, had tightened around her cup. "Because I've been complicit in something I should have refused. And because—" She stopped, looked at Clara directly. "Because you are clearly not deficient, in any sense that word should be used about a person, and it has cost me some sleep to know that I helped make you believe otherwise." "The money," Clara said. "The receipt. It came from his personal account, the household accounts. Which means it also came partially from the inheritance our father left us jointly." Dorothy paused. "Edmund handled the division of that inheritance. I have always suspected he handled it to his own advantage, but proving it would require documentation I don't have." A very slight pause. "That I don't have. Yet." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "You're not here just for Edmund," she said slowly. "You're here because you need something, too." Dorothy met her eyes. "I'm here because I need to stop being someone who lets my brother arrange the truth to his convenience. And because if there is any accounting to be done, I would rather it happen while I am still in a position to be honest about my own part in it." She looked at the unsigned document between them. I am not asking you to sign that. I am asking you to read it carefully and understand what it actually says. Clara picked up the document Edmund had sent. She read it the way she read every document, now starting with the definitions, working through the operative clauses, noting each qualifier. It took her 7 minutes. Dorothy waited without speaking. Clara set the document down. Clause 4, she said, the prohibition on remarriage. But also Clause 8, a waiver of any right to contest the grounds of the divorce. If I sign this, I can never legally challenge the basis of the dissolution. She looked at Dorothy. He's not worried about comparisons. He's worried about a challenge. Dorothy said nothing, but the set of her shoulders said yes. If I challenged the divorce on grounds of fraudulent medical documentation, Clara said, the original decree could be contested. Edmund would have to prove the grounds were legitimate, and if the grounds were not legitimate, the divorce itself might be voided. She paused, which would mean his current marriage is not legal. Silence. He's not protecting his reputation, Clara said. He's protecting his marriage. Dorothy set her cup down very carefully. I am not in a position to confirm or deny your legal analysis. No. Clara folded the unsigned document and pushed it back across the table. But you don't have to. She looked at Edmund's sister, this woman who had known the truth for years, and carried it alone, who had come here as her brother's instrument, and stayed to be something else. I'm not going to sign it. Dorothy nodded once, as though this was the answer she had expected, and perhaps in some part of herself had hoped for. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to think, Clara said. I'm going to find Dr. Gaines. And I'm going to decide what I want, not what Edmund needs, not what's easiest, not what causes the least disruption. She picked up the receipt from the table. May I keep this? Dorothy looked at it for a long moment. Then she said, I don't know that I ever had it. She stood, put on her coat, picked up her traveling case. At the door she paused, her hand on the frame, not quite looking back. The man who owns this ranch, she said. He treats you well. Very well. Good. A pause. You deserve to be treated well a long time before now. She went out into the January cold. Clara heard the hired wagon's driver click his tongue at the horses, heard the creak of wood and harness, then nothing but wind. She stood at the kitchen window with the receipt in her hand and watched the wagon disappear down the frozen track toward Millhaven. Behind her, the stove ticked with steady heat. She thought about Edmund's voice. She thought about 3 doctors with their clipboards. She thought about the jar of ash on her windowsill. She thought I was right to burn it. She did not tell Eli about the receipt that evening. She told him about Dorothy's visit in general terms, that she had refused to sign, that there were complications she was working through, that she would need to make a trip to Cheyenne. He listened and said what he always said when Clara was working through something difficult. Nothing for a while, and then something precise. When you go to Cheyenne, he said, you don't have to go alone. I know. She looked at him across the table. I'll be all right. I know you will be. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a gesture she had come to recognize as Eli locating a thought he was not sure how to deliver. I just want you to know, the offer is there. Thank you, she said, and meant it more than the 2 words could carry. They sat in their evening quiet. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the Wyoming night was absolute, no other lights for miles in any direction, just the dark and the cold and the vast, indifferent beauty of the high plains doing what they had always done. Eli cleared his throat. Clara looked up. Clara, he said, I need to tell you something. She waited. When I hired you... He stopped, started again. He was not she had learned a man who edited himself often, which meant when he did, it was because the true version was harder than the revised one. The agency that placed you, They sent a letter describing your circumstances, all of your circumstances. Clara kept her face still. Including the medical history. Silence. I need you to understand why that mattered to me, Eli said. He was looking at the table, and his jaw was set in the way it got when he was making himself say a thing he would rather not. After Margaret, I decided I was done. Done with all of it. The possibility of caring about someone. The possibility of... He stopped. I thought if I hired someone who couldn't, if there was no possibility of, I thought it would be simpler. Clara looked at her hands. The receipt was in her apron pocket. $300. Professional consultation services. You used my supposed deficiency, she said, as a way to protect yourself from your own feelings. Yes. The word came out flat and honest, and apparently cost him something. That was what I did. The kitchen was very quiet. I'm not angry, Clara said finally. You should be. Maybe. She looked up. But I understand it. You were frightened. You'd lost everything. You found a way to manage the risk. She paused. Edmund used my supposed deficiency as a way to dispose of me. Those are not the same thing. He looked at her. You need to know that they're not the same thing, she said. What you did was cowardice of a particular kind. What he did was cruelty of a particular kind. I've had both. They feel different. Eli was quiet for a long time. And now? He asked. Clara thought about Dorothy's receipt in her pocket. She thought about a doctor named Gaines and $300 and 3 years of believing something false about herself. She thought about the jar of ash on the windowsill and what it would mean to open it. Now, she said carefully, I'm not sure the medical history was accurate. Eli went very still. I have reason to believe the documentation was managed, Clara said. I can't be certain yet. I need to go to Cheyenne. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before. Something between hope and the fear of hope, the expression of a man who has been walking with his eyes on the ground for so long that looking up feels dangerous. Clara, he said, and then stopped, because there was too much in the word and not enough language for any of it. I know, she said quietly. She stood, took their cups to the basin, began the small routine of closing up the kitchen for the night. At the doorway to the hall, she paused. Eli, she said, whatever I find in Cheyenne, whatever the truth turns out to be, it doesn't change what I said. What you did was not the same as what he did. She looked at him over her shoulder. I just wanted you to know I know the difference. She went to her room. She did not sleep for a long time. She lay in the narrow bed and looked at the jar of ash on the windowsill, invisible in the dark, but present, always present, and thought about the distance between what people believe about themselves and what is actually true. I have reason to believe the documentation was managed. Even as she said it, she had known not just reason to believe, certainty. She had felt for weeks now the particular, unignorable evidence of her own body, telling her a story that contradicted every document, every diagnosis, every word of Latin precision those 3 doctors had written in their clipboards. She had not let herself think it directly. The mind, she had discovered, protects itself from hope, the same way it protects itself from loss, by refusing to look straight at the thing until the thing is unavoidable. She looked at it now. She counted backward in the dark as she had counted once before, carefully, precisely, with the attention of a woman who has learned that the most important information is always in the numbers. Her hands were very still on the coverlet. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and cold and absolutely silent, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but full of everything the land has absorbed over centuries and holds without comment. Clara lay in that silence and let herself for the first time in 3 years believe something that had no documentation to support it. She believed her body. She believed it was right. She went to Cheyenne in the second week of February on the stage that ran south through the valley on Tuesdays and Fridays. Eli drove her to Millhaven to catch it 14 miles through snow that had crusted over in the night and caught the morning light in a way that made the whole prairie look like hammered silver. He said little on the drive. She had learned to read his silences. This one was the kind that wanted to say something and was deciding whether the time was right. 3 miles from Millhaven, he apparently decided it was. "Whatever you find," he said, looking at the road ahead. "You'll come back." It was not a question, but it was not quite a statement either. It occupied the careful middle ground of something offered without demanding a response. "I'll come back," Clara said. She felt him exhale. They did not say anything else until Millhaven, where the stage was already waiting, its horses blowing steam in the cold air. Eli helped her down from the wagon. For a moment they stood facing each other on the frozen street, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a small town going about its morning, and Clara thought, this is the moment. This is the place where two careful people who have been building something in the space between words either acknowledge what they've built or pretend it isn't there. She put her gloved hand on his arm. Just for a moment. "I'll be back Thursday," she said. Eli looked at her hand on his arm. Then he looked at her face with the directness he rarely used, and that meant he was bypassing every careful filter he had. "Thursday," he said. "I'll have dinner ready." She almost laughed. She almost did not go. She got on the stage, yes. Dr. Frederick Gaines had an office on Ferguson Street in Cheyenne, in a building that was trying to look more established than it was. The sign on the door listed his credentials in the slightly aggressive manner of someone who needs people to know he has them. Clara arrived on Wednesday morning without an appointment. He was a small man in his 60s, with the careful face of someone who has spent a career managing what he allowed to show. He looked at Clara when his nurse showed her in, and something happened in his expression. Recognition, and beneath it, a kind of bracing, the look of a man who has been waiting for a particular knock on his door and has always known it would come. "Mrs. Ashwood," he said. "Mrs. Ashwood, yes." She sat without being invited. "I believe you know who I am." 3 years ago," Clara said. "November. My husband paid you $300. I have the receipt." She placed Dorothy's receipt on his desk and left her hand on it. Gaines looked at it. He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall. "I'd like to see my file," Clara said. "I'm not certain Dr. Gaines." Her voice was the voice she had found on the roof of Eli's barn in the wind, with a hammer steady, because steadiness was a choice, not an absence of feeling. "I'm not here to destroy you. I'm here to know the truth about my own body. That's all." A pause. "I think you owe me that much." Silence. Gaines looked at the receipt for a long time. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet and took out a folder. He set it on the desk between them, and he looked out the window at Ferguson Street, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashwood. I should have refused the commission." Clara opened the folder. She read it in silence. She was in Gaines's office for 40 minutes. When she walked out onto Ferguson Street, the February cold hit her face, and she stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the gray Cheyenne sky, the same sky she had left 4 months ago. But nothing else was the same. 3 years. She had spent 3 years carrying a diagnosis that had been purchased for $300 from a man who knew better. She was not deficient. She was not damaged. She was not the thing she had been told she was over and over until it became the story she told herself. She was Clara Ashwood, and she was entirely, completely, and furiously whole. She stood on Ferguson Street and let the cold hit her face, and thought, I have known this for weeks. She had known it in the way the body knows things before the mind catches up. She had felt it in the evidence that had been accumulating in her own flesh for 2 months, insistent and undeniable, and asking for nothing except to be believed. She walked back to her hotel. She sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hand on her stomach flat, still no visible sign, and she said aloud to the empty room to no one, and to herself, "Hello." No answer. But she had not expected one. It was too early for answers. It was only the beginning of the asking. She had 2 days in Cheyenne. She used one of them to consult with a lawyer, a different lawyer than Edmund's, a woman who had moved west from Boston 10 years ago and practiced family and property law with the particular directness of someone who had stopped being surprised by human nature. Clara described the situation in full, including the receipt and the file from Gaines's office which she had asked him to copy. The lawyer listened without interrupting. "You have grounds to challenge the divorce," she said when Clara finished. "The fraudulent medical documentation is actionable. Edmund would know this. Which is why he sent the settlement document. Yes, if you'd signed it, you'd have waived the right to challenge. You'd also have accepted the 5-year prohibition, which would have meant—" She paused. "You're certain you don't want to pursue the legal challenge?" Clara thought about it, truly thought about it. She thought about Edmund's face and his measured voice and the particular shape of the damage he had done. She thought about what a legal challenge would require, the months, the exposure, the public accounting of private things. She thought about what she wanted from her life versus what she might win in a courtroom. "I want a document," she said. "Not a challenge to the divorce itself. I want a document that attests to the fraudulent basis of the diagnosis. I want it notarized and on record." She paused. "And I want Edmund to know I have it." The lawyer smiled, not warmly exactly, but with the particular approval of someone who recognizes a well-made decision. "That can be arranged. And I want to be able to remarry without the 5-year restriction. Since the settlement document is unsigned, the restriction has no legal force. You're free to remarry whenever you choose." Whenever you choose. Clara looked at the lawyer's desk with its careful stacks of documents, its ordered evidence of other people's complicated lives. "Good," she said. She left the lawyer's office with 2 documents, the notarized attestation and a separate letter from the lawyer to Edmund's attorney delivered by her office, advising that her client was in possession of evidence pertaining to the original divorce proceedings. The lawyer had worded it with the elegant precision of someone who knew exactly how much pressure a single sentence could carry. Clara walked back to her hotel through the Cheyenne streets she had known for 3 years. They looked smaller than she remembered. Not diminished, simply correctly sized the way things look when you have been somewhere larger and come back. She passed Carey Avenue without meaning to. Habit of foot, perhaps, or some need to see it clearly now that she could afford to. The house was still there. Edmund and his new wife's house, though she did not know which woman lived there, now knew only that the house existed and that she had once organized her entire life around its interior. She looked at it from the street. A well-maintained house. Good proportions. The kind of house that announced its owner's success without shouting. She felt nothing in particular about it. Not the grief she had expected, not the rage, not the hollow ache that had accompanied her west on the stage 4 months ago. Simply the mild interest one feels for a place that used to matter and no longer does, like a school you attended or a town you lived in as a child. The place where something happened, not the place where you lived. She walked on. That night she sat in her hotel room and wrote in the small journal she had begun keeping since Wyoming, not the letter to herself she had written at the kitchen table, but something more daily, more particular, the record of someone trying to understand what had happened to her by writing it down. She wrote about Gaines's office, about the folder, about 40 minutes of reading documentation that described her body in clinical terms and were she now knew substantially invented. She wrote, 3 years. I believed it for 3 years because the alternative that it was a lie, deliberately constructed to serve someone else's needs, required me to believe that a person could be that calculated about another person's fundamental sense of themselves. I could not believe that then. I believe it now. She wrote, I am angry. I will allow myself to be angry for exactly as long as it is useful, and then I will put it somewhere it can't make decisions for me. She wrote, I am also, and this is the harder thing to write, the thing I have been circling for 2 months, without looking at directly, I am also certain that I am not the person those documents described. My body has been telling me this for 8 weeks. I have been afraid to listen, because hope, once you have learned not to trust it, becomes its own kind of danger. She wrote, I am going to trust it. She closed the journal. She lay on the hotel bed and put her hand on her stomach and thought about the ranch 14 miles north of Millhaven, about the lamp in the kitchen window, about a man who had spent 4 years being too careful and was beginning to learn slowly that careful and too were not the same thing. She thought Thursday. I'll be back Thursday. She slept better than she had in 3 years. She caught the Thursday stage north. Eli was waiting in Millhaven with the wagon. He was standing beside it when the stage pulled in his hat in his hands, looking at the stage with an expression that in another man with different habits of face might have been called anxious. In Eli Hale, it looked like stillness, with something underneath it that didn't want to be still. Clara stepped down. He looked at her. She looked at him. Well, he said. She reached into her traveling bag and took out the notarized document the lawyer had drafted. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back. I'll tell you tonight, she said. After dinner. Something shifted in his face. She watched him locate his composure and put it back in place, which was itself a kind of intimacy that she could see him doing it. All right, he said. Get in the wagon. It's cold. She got in the wagon. They drove north through the late afternoon light, the prairie stretching away on all sides in the flat gold of a February afternoon, and Clara sat beside Eli and felt the 14 miles pass with the particular quality of time that is both ordinary and not ordinary, at all time that knows it is being remembered, even as it happens. 2 miles from the ranch, Eli said, without looking at her, I've been thinking. About what? He was quiet for a moment, locating it. About Margaret's letter, he said. About what she asked. He kept his eyes on the road. She asked me not to let the fear win. I told myself for 4 years that I was honoring her by being careful, not by keeping things contained. A pause. I think I've been wrong about that. Clara looked at the mountains. I think she would have been quite annoyed with me, Eli said, if she could see the last 4 years. And despite everything, despite the exhaustion and the 2 days in Cheyenne and the 40 minutes in Gaines's office and the weight of the notarized document in her bag, Clara felt something loosen in her chest. Probably, she said. She had opinions, he said. Strong ones. She was not a woman who accepted unnecessary suffering without comment. No, Clara said. I don't think she was. The ranch came into view, the familiar dark shapes against the white ground smoke rising from the chimney, the barn door slightly open the way it always was. Home. The word arrived in Clara's mind without hesitation and without drama, simply as the accurate name for the place she was looking at. Home. Eli, she said. Yes. After dinner. She looked at him. There are things I need to tell you. About Cheyenne, and about... She paused. About some other things. He looked at her then briefly with those gray eyes that saw everything and said very little. After dinner. He agreed. He pulled the wagon into the yard. Clara climbed down before he could help her. Old habit. New habit, she was still working out the difference and walked toward the house. At the porch, she paused and looked back. Eli was unhitching the horses with the economy of long practice, his breath showing in the cold air, his movements sure and unhurried. The lamp in the kitchen window threw a square of yellow light onto the snow. 2 months ago, she had stood on the roof of this house and breathed in the Wyoming air and thought this is where a person starts over. She had been right. She had simply not known yet how completely. She went inside. She took off her coat. She put water on for coffee. She reached into her bag and took out the notarized document and set it on the table. Then she took out the jar of ash from where she had carried it all the way to Cheyenne and back, and she set it beside the document. She looked at them both for a moment. Then she went to the stove, because dinner needed making, and some things were better said with a full stomach and a warm house than with empty hands and cold air. She would tell him tonight. She would tell him everything. End of Part 2. Word count, Part 2. Approximately 7,200 words. What the ground holds. She told him after dinner. Not everything at once. Some things are too large to hand to a person all at one time. They need to be set down, piece by piece, like stones, each one given a moment to settle before the next. Eli cleared the table, while Clara sat with her hands around her coffee cup watching the lamp. The notarized document and the jar of ash stood side by side on the far end of the table where she had placed them before dinner and where they had remained throughout the meal, like two guests who had not yet been introduced. Eli had glanced at them once when he came in and had not asked. That was one of the things she valued most about him, the understanding that some things would be explained in their own time and that patience was a form of respect. She started with Edmund. She told him about the receipt about Gaines about 40 minutes in a Cheyenne office reading a file that described a woman who did not exist. She told him about the lawyer on Ferguson Street and the 2 documents and the letter sent to Edmund's attorney. She told him about walking past Carey Avenue and feeling nothing in particular which had surprised her, and then had not. Eli listened. He did not interrupt. His hands were flat on the table, very still. When she finished, the kitchen was quiet for a long moment. The diagnosis was false, he said. Not a question. Confirmation. Manufactured, yes. His jaw tightened in the way it did when he was containing something. And Edmund knew. Edmund arranged it. Silence. Clara. His voice was very careful. I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that whatever the answer is, it doesn't change. He stopped. Reset. It doesn't change anything important. She looked at him. Are you all right? He asked. Not are you angry? Not what are you going to do? Not any of the practical questions that a person might reasonably ask. Simply, are you all right? Clara felt something move in her chest, the specific warmth of being asked the right question by the right person at the right moment, which was rarer than it should have been and mattered more than she knew how to say. I think so, she said honestly. I was angry. I let myself be angry in Cheyenne, and then I put it somewhere it couldn't make decisions for me. She looked at the lamp. What I feel now is mostly clear. Like something I've been trying to see through fog has finally come into focus. Eli nodded slowly. There's something else, Clara said. He looked at her. She put her hand on the jar of ash, looked at it, looked at him. When I was in Cheyenne, she said, I spent the evening before the stage thinking about something I had been circling for 2 months, without letting myself look at directly. She paused. My body has been telling me something, Eli, for 8 weeks or more. I've been afraid to believe it, because I'd been taught not to trust it. Because 3 doctors told me it was impossible, and I believed them. And then another doctor confirmed what all 3 of them said, and I believed that too for 3 years. The kitchen was absolutely still. But the documentation was false, she said, and my body has been saying the same thing for 2 months, and in Cheyenne I finally let myself listen. She met his eyes. I think I'm pregnant. The word landed between them and stayed there, taking up space, requiring nothing further. Eli did not move. He sat very still in the way he sat still when the world had presented him with something that exceeded his vocabulary, and he was not yet sure whether the thing was terrible or extraordinary, or both at once. Clara watched his face. She watched him absorb it, watched him push through the first layer surprise into something underneath, something that took longer to reach the surface, and was less articulable, but more real. "How certain are you?" he asked. His voice was rough at the edges. "Not certain in any documentable way. No doctor has confirmed it." She looked at her hands. "But I've been keeping careful count, and my body doesn't lie to me the way those documents did." A pause. "I'm certain enough." Eli stood abruptly. He crossed to the window and stood with his back to her and hand on the frame, looking out at the dark yard. His shoulders rose and fell once with a breath she could see from across the room. She waited. She had learned to wait. "Clara." His voice from the window was different, stripped of its usual careful control, down to something underneath that was both older and less protected. "I need to tell you something. And I need you to hear it as what it is, not as what you might have reason to be cautious about." "All right." He turned. His face in the lamplight was open in a way she had not seen before, the way a thing looks when the last wall comes down. Not as rubble, but simply as absence, the open air where a wall used to be. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for months. I don't know exactly when it became that specific word, but it's been true for long enough that pretending otherwise has become a kind of daily dishonesty that I'm not willing to continue." Clara's hands tightened around the coffee cup. "I'm not telling you because of what you just said," Eli continued. "I'm telling you now because you came back from Cheyenne with the truth about yourself, and you sat down at this table and told me, and you deserve to sit at this table with the truth about me." He looked at her steadily. "You deserve to know that I love you, and that I would have said it before now if I hadn't spent 4 years learning to be afraid of saying exactly this." "Don't let the fear win Margaret," had written. Clara set down the coffee cup. She stood. She crossed the kitchen to where he stood at the window, and she put her hand on his face, her palm against his cheek, the rough skin of a man who worked outdoors in all weathers, and she looked at him from close enough that there was nothing else to see. "I love you too," she said. "I have for months. I don't know when it became that specific word either, but it's been true long enough that I've been writing around it in my journal for weeks without writing it directly." She felt the muscle in his jaw move under her palm. "I've been afraid, too, for different reasons, but the same fear." He put his hand over hers, the large, rough hand, pressing her palm more firmly against his face as though to ensure it was real. "The baby," he said, "if there is one." "Clara, there is one." He said it with quiet certainty, the certainty not of someone who had seen the documentation, but of someone who was trusting the same thing. She was trusting the body's knowledge, the evidence of 8 weeks, the intelligence of a woman who had been paying attention all along. "There is one," he said again, and his voice broke slightly on the second word in the way of something that has been held too long and is finally allowed to be put down. "I want to marry you," he said. "Before you tell me it's too soon, or there are complications, or we should think carefully. I know all of that. I also know that I have been thinking carefully for 4 years, and careful thought is not the same as wisdom, and I am done letting the fear tell me what is and isn't possible." He looked at her. "I want to marry you. I want to raise this child with you. I want to spend the next 40 years finding out what else you can do that I didn't expect." Clara laughed, a short, surprised sound, because she hadn't expected the last sentence, and because it was so perfectly and specifically Eli that it bypassed every defense she might have raised and landed directly in the center of her. 40 years is a long time," she said. "It's a start." She kissed him then, or he kissed her. It was difficult afterward to say who had moved first, because it happened in the way things happen, that have been building too long, with the particular inevitability of a door that has been pressed closed against pressure for months, and finally released swings open all the way. Outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming night held everything. It always held the cold, the dark, the enormous, indifferent sky, the prairie running away in all directions to its invisible edges. It held the jar of ash on the table and the notarized document beside it. It held the jar of ash on the windowsill in Clara's room, which had been a reminder all these months of what she had burned and what she had kept. It held a woman who had arrived at this ranch with one bag and the conviction that her life was essentially over. It held everything she had built since then. She saw Nora Briggs on a Thursday in early March, one of those ambiguous early spring days when the Wyoming sky cannot decide between winter and something else, and settles on a gray that could mean either, and told her sitting at Nora's kitchen table with the straightforwardness that had characterized all their conversations from the beginning. Nora set down her coffee cup. She looked at Clara for a long moment, with the assessing eyes of a woman who has delivered babies and buried children and understands the full territory of what a pregnancy means on the frontier. "You're certain?" Nora said. "Yes." "How far along?" 3 months, I think. Perhaps a little more." Nora was quiet in the way that was thinking rather than hesitation. "You'll need someone to attend the birth. I've done it before my neighbor's wife and twice for others in the valley. I know what I'm doing." "I was hoping you'd say that. The doctor in Millhaven isn't much use for anything complicated. If there's any sign of trouble, we go to Cheyenne." Nora's voice was practical in the way of someone who refuses to soften facts out of kindness and understands this is the truest kind of kindness. "First babies can be long. She paused the courteous pause of someone calculating ages without asking directly. 28, Clara said. "Not young for a first baby. Not old, either. Middle ground." Nora picked up her cup. "You're strong. That matters more than anything else." She paused again. "Does Eli know?" "Yes." And Clara thought about the night at the kitchen table. The lamp. His face at the window. "I love you. I have for months. We're going to be married," she said. Nora's expression shifted, not surprise exactly, because the expression of someone who has expected news and receives it is different from the expression of someone genuinely surprised. More like the satisfaction of a thing correctly predicted, combined with something warmer beneath it. "Good," she said. "You don't seem startled. I've watched you two dance around each other for months." Nora's mouth curved. "The only people who couldn't see it were the two of you." Clara looked at her coffee. "We were careful." "You were terrified," Nora said, not unkindly. "Both of you. For understandable reasons. But terrified and careful are different things, and it matters to know which one you're being." She reached across the table and touched Clara's hand briefly, the touch of a woman who shows affection in practical gestures rather than declarations. "I'm glad you stopped being terrified." "I'm working on it," Clara said. "Some days, more successfully than others." The town meeting about the land dispute was set for the second Friday of March. Harlan Cross had filed his formal objection through the county courthouse in Millhaven, challenging the eastern boundary of Hale Creek Ranch and claiming that a survey error made 30 years prior had given the Hale family 50 acres that rightfully abutted his own holdings. It was, Clara had determined after 3 careful readings of the relevant documents, not a genuine survey dispute. It was a negotiating position, the opening move of a man who expected to be offered a settlement rather than a fight. She had found the original survey plat in a wooden box under Eli's bed, where it had been stored, along with Margaret's things, and not looked at in 4 years. She had read it on a Tuesday afternoon while snow fell outside, cross-referencing it against the county records from the Millhaven Land Office, which Eli had obtained with a formal written request that she had helped him compose. The survey plat was dated 1869. It was precise, clearly drawn and unambiguous about the eastern boundary. The discrepancy Cross was citing did not exist in the original document. It existed only in a secondary survey conducted in 1876, 7 years later, by a surveyor whose name appeared on 3 other Cross land acquisitions in the same period. Clara set the 2 surveys side by side on the kitchen table and looked at them for a long time. "His surveyor," she said. Eli, reading over her shoulder, was very quiet. "Cross had his own man resurvey the boundary in 1876, Clara said. "After your father bought the ranch, but before the deed was fully recorded. The secondary survey moved the eastern line 20 yards west. The primary survey, the legal survey, the one registered at the time of original sale, doesn't." She looked up. "He's been waiting to use this for years. He waited until he'd acquired enough surrounding land to make the dispute worth filing." "How do you know it's his surveyor?" "The name." Clara pointed to the signature on the 1876 document. "Thomas Birch. He surveyed the Oaks property in 1874. There's a record of that sale in the county register. He surveyed the Pembroke parcel in 1875. Both of those are now Cross land." She paused. 3 surveys by the same man, all showing boundaries favorable to Cross's subsequent acquisitions. Eli studied the documents. "Can you prove it?" he asked. "Not prove, not in a court of law, not without a lawyer and months of work. But I can present it clearly enough that the town council will see the pattern." She looked at him. "The question is, whether I present it or you do." He looked at her steadily. "You found it. It's your land. You understood it." Eli. Clara. He sat down at the table, which was his way of saying that he intended to say something he had been thinking about for a while. "You've been managing this from the beginning. You read the original contract. You wrote the letter that bought us time. You went to Cheyenne and handled your own business with more competence than most lawyers I've encountered." He held her gaze. "I am not asking you to stand aside. I'm asking you to stand in front." She looked at the documents on the table. She thought about all the rooms she had waited in, all the conversations held over her head, in voices that did not include her, all the decisions made about her life in her absence by people who considered her presence unnecessary. She thought about what it would mean to walk into Millhaven's town hall and lay documents on a table and be heard not as Eli Hale's housekeeper, not as Edmund Voss's discarded wife, but as herself. Clara Ashwood, the woman who had read the fine print. "All right," she said. The town council met in the Millhaven Grange Hall, a low building at the north end of the main street that served as meeting house, occasional church overflow, and the site of every civic dispute the town had generated in its short history. It smelled of old wood and lamp oil and the particular combination of mud and boot leather that constituted the essence of a Wyoming public gathering. There were perhaps 30 people in the room when Clara and Eli arrived. Clara recognized several faces from her months in the valley: Bess Hooper in the second row, her husband beside her, Nora Briggs near the back, with her characteristic expression of someone who has strong opinions and is deciding when to deploy them, the feed store owner, whose name she had learned was Oaks, with his wife Sarah, who had wanted to know about Clara from the beginning, others whose names she was still learning, the population of a small territory assembling to watch what would happen. Harlan Cross was already there. He stood near the front with 2 men beside him, one the kind of man who held papers, and the other the kind who held things considerably heavier. He was silver-haired and expensive-suited, exactly as he had looked through the land office window on Clara's first trip to Millhaven. When she walked in, his eyes moved to her with the mild interest of a man who had not expected this particular variable. He had been told she knew that he was dealing with a rancher. He had not been told he was dealing with a rancher's wife-to-be, who had spent 3 years in a lawyer's household learning to read documents the way other people learned to read faces. Good, Clara thought. Let him be surprised. She took her place at the table the council had set up at the front of the room. 5 men across from her, the council chairman, a man named Aldridge, with the measured face of someone who had learned to reserve judgment. 4 others, who ranged from genuinely uncertain to visibly skeptical. Eli sat in the front row of chairs directly behind her. He had not argued further about who should stand at the table. He had simply driven them to Millhaven and sat down and looked at her with the expression of a man who has placed a bet he is certain about. She set 3 documents on the table. The council chairman looked at the documents and then at her. "Mrs. Ashwood," he said. There was a slight emphasis on the name, not quite a question, but carrying the implication that her presence at the table was a variation from the expected. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Aldridge." Her voice was even. She had spent 3 days deciding what her voice would sound like in this room, and she had decided it would sound like this, unhurried, not loud, carrying the specific weight of a person who has already done the reading and is simply presenting the results. Harlan Cross's attorney rose immediately. "Mr. Chairman, I'd like to note for the record that the respondent's representative is—" "Sit down," Clara said. The room went quiet, in the particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Cross's attorney sat down. He did it the way a man sits down when he is surprised into it, without quite having decided to. Clara let the silence stand for a moment. Then she continued, "Mr. Aldridge, the objection filed by Mr. Cross claims a survey error that shifted the eastern boundary of Hale Creek Ranch approximately 20 yards west of its legal position." She placed her hand on the first document. "This is the original survey plat from 1869. The eastern boundary is marked clearly. It has not changed." She placed her hand on the second document. "This is a secondary survey conducted in 1876, 7 years after the original, by a surveyor named Thomas Birch." She let the name sit in the air for a moment, then continued. "Mr. Birch has conducted surveys on 3 properties in this valley. In each case, his survey was conducted after the original sale and before Crossland and Cattle Company filed acquisition paperwork. In each case, his survey showed a boundary variation favorable to Mr. Cross's subsequent claim." She paused. "This is not a survey error. This is a pattern." She placed the third document on the table. "This is a record of the 3 transactions. The Hale Creek boundary is the most recent. The Oaks property." She looked at the feed store owner in the second row. His expression had become very alert. "Was the first. Mr. Oaks lost 8 acres off his southern boundary through a 1874 Birch survey, 3 months before he sold to Cross at a price that reflected the reduced acreage." She looked back at the council. "I have the sale prices and the acreage figures if the council would like to see them." The room was very still. Cross stood. He did it with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to controlling rooms. "Mr. Chairman, this is Mr. Cross." Aldridge raised one hand without looking at him. He was looking at the documents on the table. "You'll have your opportunity." He picked up the original survey plat and studied it, passed it to the council member on his left. That man studied it and passed it to the next. Clara stood at the table and watched the document travel the length of the council row and felt the room shift not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that rooms shift when information has been presented clearly enough that it cannot be unseen. She had not raised her voice once. She had not accused anyone directly of anything illegal. She had simply set 3 documents on a table and explained what they said. When the plat completed its circuit and returned to Aldridge, he set it down and looked at Cross with an expression that was careful and absolutely neutral, and said underneath that neutrality something that did not require words. Cross's attorney rose again. He made an argument that was technically competent and substantially beside the point, speaking for several minutes about survey methodology and the limitations of 19th century instruments and the good faith nature of his client's filing. Clara did not interrupt. She stood at the table and listened and did not write anything down because everything she needed to say she had already said. When he finished, Aldridge looked at her. "Mrs. Ashwood, anything to add?" "No," Clara said. "The documents speak for themselves." She sat down. Cross leaned to his attorney and said something in a low voice. The attorney shook his head slightly. Cross's jaw tightened. The counsel conferred in the low murmur of people who have already reached a conclusion and are doing the courtesy work of appearing to deliberate. It took 11 minutes. Clara counted. "The counsel finds insufficient basis for the boundary objection as filed," Aldridge announced. "The Hale Creek Ranch eastern boundary stands as recorded in the original 1869 survey. Mr. Cross, if you have evidence of genuine survey error, you are welcome to file through the county assessor's office with appropriate documentation." He paused. "New documentation, conducted by a surveyor who has not previously worked on your behalf." Cross stood very still for a moment. Then he picked up his hat from the chair beside him and put it on, and walked out of the Grange Hall with the measured stride of a man who is not accustomed to this particular experience, and intends to be alone before he lets it show. His 2 men followed. The room exhaled. Eli was beside her before she had fully stood. He did not say anything. He simply put his hand on her back between her shoulder blades, a touch so specific and so certain that she felt it travel the full length of her spine. Bess Hooper appeared at her elbow. "That was the most interesting council meeting in 6 years," she said. "Mrs. Hooper." Clara turned. "The Oaks property. Your husband might want to speak with Mr. Oaks about the 1874 serve. There may be grounds for a separate action." Bess looked at her for a long moment. Then she said with a warmth Clara had not previously heard from her, "I'll tell him tonight." Nora was last appearing at Clara's side as they moved toward the door, her expression carrying the particular quality of a friend who has watched something and is quietly pleased. "You said 3 sentences," Nora said. "Then you sat down." 4 sentences, Clara said. "I said sit down. That counted." Nora laughed a real laugh, unguarded, the kind that meant something had genuinely surprised her. She put her arm briefly through Clara's as they went out into the March evening, and Clara felt the warmth of it, the simple human warmth of being known by someone. Outside, the sky had cleared during the meeting, and the stars were beginning to show the particular star density of a Wyoming night that always stopped Clara with the force of something too large to be fully absorbed. Eli came to stand beside her. "You didn't need me there at all," he said. "I needed you in the front row," Clara said. "That was not nothing." He considered this. "Fair. Also," she said, "I need you to drive me home because I cannot feel my feet." He looked down. She was wearing her good shoes, the ones she had worn to be taken seriously, which were not built for March mud or March cold, both of which Millhaven was currently providing in generous quantities. "Next time," Eli said, handing her up into the wagon with the careful hands of a man who was no longer pretending he didn't want to touch her, "wear the boots." "Next time," Clara said, "there won't be a next time. Cross won't try again." "You're sure?" "He's a man who depends on people not knowing how to read. He won't go back into a room where someone can." She pulled the blanket across her lap. "Drive." He drove. They were married on the first Saturday of April in the Millhaven church, with the crooked steeple by the minister who had been in the valley for 11 years, and had the kind face of a man who considers himself fortunate in his work. Nora Briggs stood as witness on Clara's side. Nora's husband, a quiet man named William, who regarded the world with amiable stillness, stood on Eli's. It was not a large wedding. Clara had not wanted a large wedding. She had been married before in the way that required an audience to be real, and she had learned something about the difference between a ceremony that was witnessed and a ceremony that was true. This one was both, but the second mattered more. She wore her best dress, the blue wool newly mended at the cuffs, pressed the night before, until it held the shape of effort. She carried no flowers because it was early April in Wyoming, and flowers had opinions about when they appeared, and those opinions did not include the first Saturday of the month. She carried instead a small sprig of dried sage that Nora had brought her, which smelled like the prairie itself, like clean distance and old sun, and all the things that had no name, but were recognizable instantly. Eli wore the scarf she had knitted him the previous winter. He had worn it without comment, and she had not remarked on it because they both understood what it meant, without the remark. The minister read the service in a voice that gave the words their full weight, without performance. Clara listened carefully. She had heard wedding vows before, had spoken them before, in a Cheyenne church with a congregation and good flowers, and a dress that had cost more than her current monthly wage, and she had been sincere when she said them, and they had meant nothing. In the end, not because she had lied, but because sincerity is not enough when the thing being promised is not actually being offered. This time she listened to the words with the attention she had learned to give to documents she intended to honor. To have and to hold from this day forward. For better, for worse. For richer, for poorer. In sickness and in health. She said them clearly, looking at Eli's face. He said them back, looking at hers, with the same directness, no carefully managed expression, no social performance, simply a man saying the truest thing he knew how to say in the plainest language available. I do. He did. She did. The crooked steeple above them held its position against the April sky, neither straight nor fallen, doing the imperfect work it had always done. Spring came to Hale Creek Ranch the way it always did, not all at once, but in argument advancing and retreating, the grass greening, and then lying under a late snow, and then greening again more insistently, until even the Wyoming weather conceded the point. Clara's body kept its own argument with change and gravity, expanding, with the quiet stubbornness of a thing that has decided to exist, regardless of prior authority's opinion on the subject. By May, she had to let out the seams on 2 of her dresses. By June, she had made new ones, practical things, comfortable things, nothing that required the kind of stillness she no longer had patience for. Eli had cleared out the small room off the bedroom by late April building in a window that faced south and east, and caught the morning light exactly as she had described once in passing, in the way you describe a thing you think you want, when you're still pretending you don't expect to get it. She had not reminded him she'd said it. He had remembered anyway. The cradle came next, built from a piece of walnut he had been keeping for years in the barn, waiting without knowing what for, in the way certain materials wait. She watched him sand it one evening by lamplight, the slow, patient strokes of a man doing something he is trying to do well, and thought about Margaret's letter. Don't let the fear win. She thought about what it must have cost him to sand that wood, to build a thing for a baby in the room where he had built another room for a baby who had not arrived, and a woman who had not survived. She didn't say anything. She sat across from him and mended a small shirt and let him do the work of it, because some things need to be done in silence and with someone present, and she was learning when to be the second kind of witness. When he finished, he set the cradle on the floor between them and looked at it for a moment. "It's good work," Clara said. "It'll last," he said, which was for Eli the highest compliment available. The summer was long and hot and harder than the previous one had been, or perhaps simply felt that way, because Clara was carrying more than she had before. She was tired in a bone-deep way that no amount of sleep fully addressed, uncomfortable in ways she catalogued without complaint, because complaint had never helped, and because her body was doing something remarkable, and she had decided to grant it the benefit of the doubt. Nora came twice a month now, and the visits had shifted in character from friendship with undertones of surveillance to something more comfortable and mutual. 2 women sitting in the shade of the porch in the afternoons, talking about the things women talk about when they have enough trust for honesty. Children and fear, and the gap between what you expected from your life and what arrived, and how the arrived thing was usually stranger and more specific, and somehow more true than anything you could have ordered. "Are you afraid?" Nora asked one afternoon in late July. "Yes," Clara said immediately. "Good. The ones who aren't afraid are always more trouble." "That's not particularly reassuring." "It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate." Nora handed her a glass of water. "You're in better shape than most first mothers I've seen. Strong, sensible, not trying to do everything yourself." "I'm trying to do everything myself." "Less than you were in October." Nora's expression was dry. "I've been watching. You've learned to ask for help. That's not nothing." Clara thought about it. She supposed, learned this, or begun to learn it. It had required a fundamental revision of how she thought about competence. For most of her life, self-sufficiency had felt like armor, the proof that she didn't need anything from anyone, which was useful when anyone had so little to offer. But armor was heavy, and Eli was not nobody, and Nora was not nobody, and the people she had found in this valley were not nobody, and she was learning slowly to let them be what they were. "Eli is terrified," she said. "Of course he is." "He doesn't show it." "He shows it to you," Nora said. "That's the difference." She looked at Clara directly. "He trusts you with it. That's not nothing either." The baby came on a Thursday in August, 2 weeks before Clara had calculated, and in the middle of a thunderstorm that seemed personally invested in the drama of the occasion. Nora arrived in time, barely having ridden the 15 miles from her ranch in weather that made the journey difficult, arriving at the door drenched and entirely calm, carrying her bag of instruments, and the expression of a woman who has seen enough of birth to know it is almost always harder than expected and almost always manageable. Eli was sent to boil water, and then, when there was enough boiling water, sent to the barn, to occupy himself with tasks that Nora invented for the purpose. He was not far. Clara knew he was not far. She could hear between contractions the sound of him in the barn movement, the soft sound of horses, the occasional creak of the door opening and then closing as he stood in the frame and looked toward the house, and then made himself go back in. It was long. Not as long as the worst, but long enough. 12 hours from first clear contraction to the moment that Nora looked up with the expression of someone completing a work she is satisfied with, and said, "There she is." Clara had not known it would be a girl. She had not let herself choose a preference, had consciously kept the question open, had told herself it did not matter which was true. But when Nora said she, something happened in Clara's chest that was different from what she had expected. Something specific and immediate and enormous. A girl. Nora placed her on Clara's chest, small and furious and dark-haired, announcing herself to the room with the full commitment of someone who has made the difficult journey and has opinions about the conditions at the destination. Clara put her hand on her daughter's back, felt the tiny, furious heartbeat, the rise and fall of new lungs doing their first work. The baby turned her head against Clara's skin with the blind certainty of the newborn, searching and finding, and Clara felt the strange, overwhelming physicality of it, the reality of this small person who had existed inside her body for 9 months, and now existed outside it, in the world, particular and specific, and entirely her own. "Hello," Clara said, for the second time. The first time had been in a Cheyenne hotel room to a possibility. This time, it was to a person. The baby made a sound that was not quite an answer, but was directed at her, and Clara thought, there you are. She sent Nora to get Eli. He came in with the quality of a man who has been holding himself very still for 12 hours, and is now being asked to move, and who is not entirely sure his body remembers how. His face when he saw them, Clara against the pillows, their daughter on her chest, was not expressible in the limited vocabulary of human faces. It required too many things at once. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at his daughter with the specific gravity of a man rearranging his understanding of the world to accommodate a new and permanent fact. "She's real," he said. It was not a foolish thing to say. It was the only accurate thing. "She's real," Clara agreed. He put out one finger, and the baby, with the magnificent indifference of the newborn, wrapped her hand around it. Eli looked at that hand, the miniature fingers the absolute certainty of their grip, and Clara watched him absorb it. Watched him complete the transit from the man who had spent 4 years not wanting to want anything to whatever he was now, which was different and permanent and could not be undone, and which she understood he did not want undone, not even slightly, not for anything. "What's her name?" he asked. They had discussed names in the careful way they discussed important things, not arguing, but turning possibilities over, slowly setting them down, and looking at them from different angles. "Margaret," Clara said, "if you still want that." He had suggested it 2 months ago hesitantly, with the clear expectation that she might refuse. She had not refused. She had asked only whether he was sure, and he had said yes with the steadiness of a man who has thought about something long enough to know his own mind. He looked at his daughter. "Margaret," he said, "not with grief or not with grief alone, with something layered and complicated, and ultimately underneath all the layers grateful. The way you say the name of someone who shaped you, even if the shaping was hard." The thunder had moved on by then. Rain was still falling, quiet rain, the kind that comes after a storm has spent itself, softer and more patient. Clara could hear it on the roof Eli had repaired, and she had helped finish the roof that had been the first thing she understood about herself in this place. The rain on the roof of a house that held. On a morning in late September, when the aspen on the creek banks had gone gold, and the air had the bite of early fall, Clara stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Eli cross the yard, with Margaret in the crook of his arm. He was talking to her. She could see his mouth moving, could not hear the words through the glass. He was showing her something, the mountains, perhaps, or the light on the creek. The kind of thing you show a child who cannot yet understand it, because the showing is its own purpose independent of the understanding. Margaret's face was turned toward whatever he was pointing at. 2 months old, dark-haired like her father, with an expression of focused attention that Clara was beginning to think was the most characteristic thing about her. Clara put her hand flat on the kitchen window. The glass was cold. She thought about the receipt in the drawer of her desk, the notarized attestation from the Cheyenne lawyer, the evidence of $300, and a man named Gaines, and a thing that had been done to her that should not have been done. She thought about it sometimes the way you think about a scar, not constantly, not with obsession, but occasionally, and without the flinching that used to accompany it. The scar was part of the skin now. It had healed into the surface of her, and changed its texture, and would always be there, but it did not require her attention. She thought about the jar of ash on the windowsill. She had carried it to Cheyenne and back, had brought it home from Cheyenne, changed not the jar, but herself changed by what she had found, and confirmed, and carried back. And then she had set it on the windowsill in the small room off the bedroom that had been cleared and painted, and turned into a room for a child. And she had looked at it for a long time, one evening in early spring. Then she had opened the window. She had pulled the cork from the jar, and tipped the ash out into the April air, and the wind had taken it, the same kind of wind that had taken it on the stage from Cheyenne, the same enormous, impartial Wyoming wind that took everything eventually if you held it out long enough. She had watched the ash disperse and become invisible and become nothing. Then she had set the jar on the windowsill of Margaret's room empty, just glass, just the amber light of evening coming through it and catching in the bottom and turning that small space warm, a vessel that had held something it no longer needed to hold. She had not been able to explain it better than that, and had not tried. Eli came back across the yard now, Margaret still in the crook of his arm, and looked up and saw Clara at the window. He raised one hand in the unhurried acknowledgement of a man entirely at ease in the moment he occupies. Clara raised hers. She thought 3 years ago I sat in the parlor of a house on Cary Avenue and heard my worth estimated in a public voice by a man who needed me to be less than I was. I sat very still, and I did not argue, and I did not fight, and I went upstairs and I packed one bag. I burned the document that defined my inadequacy. I went west. She thought I built something from the burning. Not despite it, not in spite of it, from it. The burning was the beginning. The ash was the material. She went to the door and opened it and stepped out onto the porch, and the September air came in around her, cold and clean, and smelling of coming frost and far-off snow, and the creek running low in its bed, and the grass going brown again in its long cycle, and underneath all of it, underneath everything, the smell of the land itself, ancient, indifferent, and more generous than it appeared. "Cold out," Eli said, coming up the steps. "I know." She held out her arms for Margaret. He placed the baby in her arms with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this for 2 months and intends to do it for the rest of his life. Margaret turned her face toward Clara's warmth and made the sound she made when she was neither hungry nor distressed, but simply present, a small affirmation, a signal transmitted on no particular frequency except the frequency of being alive. "She was looking at the mountains," Eli said. "She kept turning toward them." "She has opinions," Clara said. "She gets that from her mother." Clara looked at her daughter's face, the focused dark eyes, the expression of someone attending carefully to an enormous world. She thought, "You will be told things about yourself that aren't true. Everyone is. The world is full of people who need you to be less than you are, so they can be comfortable with themselves." She thought, "You will learn to burn what needs burning and keep what remains." She thought, "I'll teach you. Not the burning, you'll learn that yourself, but how to tell the difference between what you're holding and what's holding you." The September sun was at that particular angle that would be gone in a month, the last warmth before winter, the light that made everything look like a photograph of itself, golden and specific and aware of its own impermanence. Clara stood on the porch of a house she had come to as a stranger with one bag, and nothing she believed about herself that was accurate. And she held her daughter in the September light, and she felt the weight of her 8 pounds of entirely specific and undeniable personhood, and thought, "There is nothing deficient here." There never was. That evening, after Margaret was asleep and the dinner things were washed and the fire banked for the night, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her journal and a candle, and wrote the letter she had written once before in this same kitchen, with a candle in the same place. Then she had written to herself at the beginning, the frightened woman on the stage from Cheyenne, the woman who had burned a document and kept the ash, and was not yet sure why. This time, she wrote something different. She wrote, "I am writing this from a kitchen I know. Outside, it is September, and the aspens are gold on the creek, and my daughter is asleep in the next room, and my husband is reading in the chair by the fire, and I am here, which is to say I am exactly where I am, which is to say I am entirely myself." She wrote, "I was told I was deficient. I believed it for 3 years. I want to be precise about this. I believed it not because I was weak, but because I had not yet learned that authority and truth are not the same thing. I have learned this now. It cost something to learn it, and I would not give back the learning for anything." She wrote, "The jar on the windowsill in Margaret's room is empty. I emptied it in April. I don't need the reminder anymore because the thing it was reminding me of has become the thing I know, not a lesson to be learned, but a fact to be inhabited." She wrote, My name is Clara Ashwood Hale. I came to Wyoming with one bag. I can fix a roof, read a contract, whether attend a public meeting, and say 4 sentences that determine the outcome. I know the difference between fear and caution. I know what it costs to let someone help you, and what it costs not to. I have a daughter named Margaret, which is a name that belongs to more than one person, and the belonging does not diminish it. She wrote, "I am not finished. I am not even close." She closed the journal, put it on the shelf with the others. She blew out the candle. In the dark from the room down the hall, she could hear her daughter breathing the small, steady sound of a new person doing the first and most essential work of being alive. Clara sat in the dark kitchen of her house and listened to that sound, and outside the Wyoming night was everything it had always been, vast and cold and full of distances that had no end, and inside the house was warm and lit from within by the particular light of a life being lived all the way to its edges. She had come here with nothing she believed about herself that was accurate. She had been wrong about that, too. She had come here with everything. She had simply needed time to find out what it was. End of Part 3. Total word count: Part 1, 7,550. Part 2, 6,800. Part 3, 900. Total, 23,450 words. Would you like a cover image created for this story?